There are films that entertain, and then there are films that haunt. Million Dollar Baby belongs to the second category, and it has belonged there since the moment it quietly slipped into theaters in December of 2004. What most people remember about this movie is the way it made them feel, that specific kind of emotional devastation that doesn't lift when the credits roll and doesn't fully leave you even weeks later. But what most people never knew, and what makes the film even more remarkable in retrospect, is how close it came to never existing at all. The story behind this story is one of rejection, stubbornness, fear, and a series of near misses that would have robbed cinema of one of its most uncompromising achievements. Every secret buried inside its production reveals the same uncomfortable truth. Greatness isn't handed to anyone. Sometimes it has to survive everything the industry throws at it before it can reach the screen. Long before a single frame was shot, the screenplay that would eventually become this film was doing something unusual for Hollywood. It was surviving. Based on short stories written by FX Tool, a pen name used by a real-life boxing cutman named Jerry Boyd, the material was raw in a way that made studio executives deeply uncomfortable. It wasn't just a subject matter. A female boxer clawed her way out of poverty, though that alone was enough to give most financiers pause. It was the tone, the ending, the complete absence of the kind of narrative safety net that Hollywood had built its modern identity around. Studios read it, admired it, and walked away. There was no franchise potential sitting inside these pages. No sequel hook, no built-in demographic that made the financial math feel manageable. Producers who genuinely respected the quality of the writing still couldn't figure out how to justify writing the check. So the script kept moving, drifting from one desk to another like something that refused to die, quietly no matter how many times it was politely turned away. That stubbornness, the refusal of a handful of believers to let the material disappear into the development graveyard, is ultimately what connected it to the one filmmaker who would take it seriously. That filmmaker wasn't the obvious choice. Clint Eastwood wasn't considered the natural fit for a story centered on a young woman fighting her way through a brutal sport. His reputation was built on restraint and economy, a no-nonsense filmmaking style that some in the industry felt might not translate to the kind of emotional heat this particular story required. There were questions about whether his name alone could ease the financial anxiety surrounding such uncommercial material. But Eastwood read the script and recognized something personal in it that had nothing to do with boxing or gender or genre. He saw a story about mentorship, about loyalty, about the kind of irreversible choices that quietly define an entire life. His interest was genuine and deep, but even that wasn't enough to immediately unlock the funding. The combination of an artistically restrained director and an uncommercial story kept investors hesitant. What finally moved the needle was Eastwood's willingness to operate on his own terms. He would shoot fast, keep the budget modest, and work without studio interference. That trade-off gave him something far more valuable than a larger production budget. It gave him total creative freedom, and that freedom shaped every single decision that followed. Finding the actress to carry the film turned out to be its own particular kind of torture. The role demanded something that couldn't be faked. Whoever took it on would need to undergo serious physical transformation while simultaneously maintaining an emotional rawness that is almost impossible to manufacture or sustain. Several major names circled the project at various points. Sandra Bullock was among them, actively pushing to get the film into production, working hard to secure the backing it needed. But the financing delays that had plagued the project from the beginning didn't stop when serious talent became attached. Windows opened and then closed again before anything could be locked in. Schedules fell apart. By the time real momentum finally built behind production, the alignment of opportunity, timing, and willingness that any casting requires had shifted completely. Hilary Swank entered the picture at exactly the moment others had stepped away. Her passion for the role was immediate and unmistakable. She didn't negotiate her commitment or protect herself from its demands. She simply said yes, completely and without reservation, and that fierce willingness to give everything the role required turned out to be the only qualification that mattered when everything else is stripped away. What Swank actually gave to prepare for this role went far beyond anything that could be captured in a simple description of her training routine. She spent months working with professional boxing coaches, gaining close to 20 pounds of pure muscle, reshaping her body from the ground up to move and look like a real fighter. Her daily schedule was punishing in a way that left little room for anything else. Hours of boxing drills, strength and conditioning work, footwork exercises, sparring sessions that left her physically depleted long before cameras started rolling. But the physical toll was only part of the story. Eastwood's efficient minimum take approach to filming meant that every scene required her to arrive fully present and emotionally raw, without the luxury of warming up across multiple attempts. Minor injuries accumulated throughout the shoot. Deep exhaustion became her baseline. And still she showed up every day, having made the decision, apparently firm and non-negotiable, that nothing in her performance would be manufactured. No camera tricks, no digital assistance, no padding or illusion. Every punch thrown, every bruise earned, every visible moment of fatigue was going to be real, or she wasn't interested in the role at all. That commitment gave the film a foundation of physical truth that no amount of choreography or post-production work could have replicated. The fight sequences themselves were built on that same foundation of uncompromising authenticity. From the earliest stages of production, the filmmakers made a decision that separated this movie from virtually every other boxing film made before it. They rejected the polished, over-dramatized style of Hollywood sports sequences, where spectacle routinely overrides believability. Instead, they brought in actual trainers and professional fighters to consult on how real boxing looks and feels and moves. The choreography that emerged from those consultations was built entirely around realism. Punches were designed to land with genuine weight rather than theatrical exaggeration. Camera angles stayed uncomfortably close and tight, mimicking the claustrophobic intensity of actually being at ringside rather than watching from a comfortable distance. There were no slow-motion glamour shots designed to thrill rather than inform. What audiences saw instead were raw, exhausting exchanges that looked and felt exactly like what actually happens inside a ring. This decision to strip away every layer of Hollywood excess turned every match in the film into something visceral and immediate, and it made the story's devastating turns hit harder than they ever could have if the fights had been presented as spectacle rather than truth. Eastwood's approach to the entire production reflected a philosophy that extended far beyond fight choreography. Where most directors build safety into their process with multiple camera angles, extensive coverage, and backup footage that give the editing room options to work with, Eastwood did none of that. Scenes were shot with minimal coverage. One take, maybe two, and then the company moved on. What happened on set was almost entirely what would end up on screen. There was no net beneath anyone's performance, no opportunity to fix something in post or find a better angle in a backup take. Every actor in every scene had to arrive fully formed and emotionally present from the first moment the camera rolled, because the first moment was very likely the only moment they would get, for a story that demanded genuine vulnerability from everyone involved. This approach stripped away every hiding place that professional technique typically offers. What it produced was something that cannot be manufactured any other way. An immediacy, a sense of witnessing something private rather than performed, a quality of emotional truth that deliberate, controlled filmmaking almost never delivers. The pressure was real, and it produced something real in return. The studio that ultimately backed the film had worked with Eastwood long enough to trust him with the process. Warner Brothers understood his pace, his budget discipline, and his commitment to finishing without drama. None of that worried them. What kept executives up at night was the story itself. A female boxer fighting her way out of poverty was already a harder sell than anything in their comfortable zone. But the film's final act pushed into moral territory that made even seasoned Hollywood professionals deeply anxious. The questions the story raises in its closing sequences about dignity, mercy, and the right of one person to make an irreversible decision on behalf of another aren't the kind of questions that focus groups are designed to handle. They don't translate easily into promotional campaigns or 30-second television spots. Behind closed doors, the fear was that the film might not just divide critics, but ignite a sustained cultural backlash from advocacy groups, religious organizations, and political commentators who would use it as a platform for arguments that had very little to do with filmmaking. In the end, Warner Brothers trusted Eastwood the way you trust someone whose track record has earned that trust, reluctantly and not without anxiety, but genuinely. They stepped back and let the story be what it needed to be. The marketing campaign that eventually surrounded the film was itself a kind of creative act, built entirely around concealment. Everything about how the movie was promoted, The trailers, the posters, the press materials presented it as an underdog sports drama with an inspirational arc. Not a single element of the campaign hinted at the moral weight waiting in the second half. Audiences walked into theaters expecting one kind of experience and received something fundamentally different. This wasn't accidental. It was a calculated decision made by a team that understood the ending, once known in advance, might prevent some viewers from taking the journey at all. The risk of making people feel deceived was real and acknowledged, but it was considered less dangerous than the alternative. What the strategy produced, entirely unexpectedly, was a viewing experience in which the emotional investment built during the film's first half made the shift in its second half devastating in a way that no amount of prior knowledge could have prepared anyone for. The surprise didn't alienate audiences. It pulled them deeper in. And once they were in, they couldn't easily find their way back out. The controversy that followed the film's wider release was something the filmmakers had anticipated intellectually, but couldn't fully prepare for emotionally. The ethical question at the story's core, the decision Frankie makes in those final scenes, was always going to generate argument. What surprised even those most closely involved with the production was the intensity and the organization of the response. Disability rights advocates raised substantive concerns about what the film's resolution implied about the quality of life experienced by people with severe physical conditions. Religious commentators condemned the moral choice of the narrative center in direct and unambiguous terms. Political figures used the film as a vehicle for advancing broader cultural arguments that extended well beyond cinema into territory that had nothing to do with storytelling craft. Through all of it, the filmmakers held to a position they had established before cameras ever rolled. Any attempt to soften the moral dilemma at the story's center would have destroyed the foundation the entire narrative was built on. They accepted the consequences of telling an honest story as the price of telling it at all. Morgan Freeman's narration, now so deeply associated with the film that it's genuinely difficult to imagine a story without it, almost didn't exist. Early versions of the project leaned more heavily on visual storytelling, trusting images and performances to carry the emotional weight without any guiding voice. The addition of narration came later in the process, and it wasn't a decision that arrived without resistance. Some within the creative team felt that voiceover carried real risks for a film built on restraint. Too much explanation, they argued, would undermine the very quality that made the material powerful. Holding the audience's hand through scenes that should speak for themselves would reduce complexity to sentiment. Others pushed back. The emotional terrain the story covered was demanding enough that some form of cohesion, some voice that could provide context without overwhelming the imagery, felt necessary. The debate was genuine and sometimes tense. What settled it was Freeman's delivery itself, which turned out to be something none of the arguments had fully accounted for. His narration didn't explain anything. It reflected. It carried warmth and regret and quiet authority simultaneously, adding layers without ever telling the audience what to feel. A clumsy addition became one of the film's most defining elements. The title that most viewers take as a straightforward boxing reference turns out to carry a meaning that shifts and deepens throughout every stage of the film. In boxing, $1 Million Baby describes a fighter whose potential value exceeds what anyone initially expected. Someone whose greatness emerges from the most unlikely circumstances and the lowest possible starting points. That's where the phrase begins, rooted in the language of gamble and surprise. But as the story moves forward, the title quietly changes what it means. It stops measuring athletic potential and starts measuring something far more personal, something that can't be expressed in dollar amounts or victory records. It becomes a question of what one life is worth to another person, what they would sacrifice for it, what they would risk or surrender on its behalf. By the film's final act, the title has traveled so far from its original meaning that it carries the full weight of the moral decision at the story's center, and the question it implicitly asks, what is a life truly worth, is one the film deliberately refuses to answer. The religious dimension threaded to the character of Frankie Dunn was never surface decoration. Frankie attends Mass regularly. He engages his priests in conversations that are persistently uncomfortable, the kind of questions that suggest a man whose faith provides no easy comfort and whose doubts are as active as his belief. These details were embedded intentionally to establish the moral framework through which every major decision in the film would eventually be filtered. The guilt Frankie carries, rooted in a fractured relationship with his daughter that the film references but never fully explains, shapes everything about how he approaches Maggie. The caution, the gradual deepening of protective devotion, the tension between what his faith instructs him to do and what his conscience is demanding he consider. What makes this dimension of the film so quietly devastating is its refusal to resolve anything. Faith and guilt are presented not as opposing forces with a winner, but as inseparable companions that guide, burden, and ultimately fail to provide the clarity Frankie most desperately needs. The audience is left with the same agonizing uncertainty that defines his journey from beginning to end. The early test screenings produced a response that genuinely alarmed studio executives for reasons that had nothing to do with the film being poorly received. When the credits rolled in those initial screenings, the rooms fell into silence, not restless, shifting, uncertain silence, but heavy and prolonged silence that stayed in place long after the film had ended. For a brief moment, the people responsible for the film's release interpreted this as a failure. The story had gone too far. It had left audiences cold. But as they gathered and analyzed feedback more carefully, what emerged was something they hadn't been prepared to interpret correctly in the moment. The silence wasn't indifference. It was the sound of audiences processing something they hadn't expected to feel at that depth. People weren't disengaged. They were overwhelmed. Many reported needing time to collect themselves before they could articulate any response at all. The studio executives who slowly came to understand what they were looking at realized something important. They were watching rooms full of people who had just been moved past the point where entertainment lives, into somewhere more personal, more uncomfortable, and considerably more lasting. The refusal to tell the audience what it thinks sits at the very center of the film's design, and is responsible for most of what makes it still worth arguing about decades later. There is no moral instruction delivered through dialogue. No character steps forward to explain the correct course of action. The story presents its central dilemma with complete honesty, and then steps away, offering no verdict, no reassurance, and no guidance about whether anyone involved made the right choice. This was an oversight or a failure of nerve. It was the entire point. The moment the film picked a side, it would have lost its emotional complexity. A clear answer would have reduced an agonizing human dilemma to a simple argument with a winner and a loser, by withholding judgment entirely. The film forces every viewer to sit alone with the discomfort of genuine uncertainty and find their own conclusion without any help from the screen. Most films offer a cathartic release somewhere near the end, a moment where tension breaks and the audience is gently told how to feel. This one never provides that release. It trusts viewers enough to leave the hardest questions completely open, and the debate that trust creates doesn't end when the lights come up. The sound design made the same deliberate choice as the direction and the score. There are moments in the film where the soundtrack simply stops. No music, no ambient noise, no emotional signal telling viewers how to respond to what they're watching. These silences weren't accidents or gaps. They were calculated decisions designed to remove every layer of comfort between the audience and the raw human situation on screen. In a medium that typically uses music to guide emotion and signal meaning, the complete absence of sound became its own kind of powerful statement. The effect is immediate and deeply exposing. Without an orchestral swell to soften a scene or a gentle melody to ease attention, audiences are left with nothing but facial expressions, breathing, and the weight of decisions being made in real time. There's no safety net of cinematic convention to hold on to. Eastwood understood that this kind of restraint could land harder than any composition he might write or select for those moments, and he exercised it with deliberate precision. The quiet scenes are the ones that linger longest in memory, not because of what viewers heard, but because of everything they didn't. Eastwood composed the film's score himself, and the approach he brought to it reflected exactly the same philosophy that guided every other decision in production. The music was never intended to lead. It existed to support without ever stepping in front of what it was supporting. The compositions are sparse in a way that deliberately contradicts how most Hollywood dramas handle music. Studios routinely push for sweeping, emotionally manipulative soundtracks that amplify every dramatic moment and ensure the audience feels everything at full volume. Eastwood rejected that instinct entirely. His score moves through the film like quiet background thoughts rather than declarations, built on simple piano phrases and understated guitar lines that suggest feeling without insisting on it. The result is a soundtrack that most viewers barely register consciously, and that was always the goal. Films that rely on manipulative music to generate emotion often feel transparent and dated within a few years. This score ages remarkably well precisely because it never overreaches. It simply holds the door open and trusts the performances and the story to carry whatever weight needs to be carried. The hit pit, Frankie's worn-down boxing gym, does something in this film that most settings and most movies never manage to do. It becomes a character, not through elaborate production design or obviously symbolic imagery, but through the way the film treats it as the one place in the story where pretense falls away completely. Characters don't just train inside those walls. They confess. They admit failures they wouldn't acknowledge anywhere else. They allow other people past offenses they've spent years carefully constructing. The low lighting, the worn equipment, the specific echo of effort and exhaustion all create an atmosphere of simultaneous isolation and intimacy that the film uses with extraordinary precision. Nearly every honest exchange between Frankie and Maggie happens within that space. It's where trust is slowly and painfully earned, where the relationship of the film's center deepens into something that the story's later events will make unbearable to watch. The gym is treated not as a location, but as a witness to everything that actually matters in the narrative, a sacred and deteriorating space where the film quietly lays every brick of an emotional foundation. The authenticity that runs through every corner of this film traces directly back to its source material and to the man who created it. Jerry Boyd spent decades as a cut man in professional boxing, working corners and watching the sport's beauty and violence from the closest possible position. His short stories weren't constructed from research or imagination. They were assembled from experience, from years of watching Real fighters carry themselves with the specific combination of confidence and vulnerability that only people who have actually been in a ring understand. The characters who populate this film speak and move in ways that can only come from that kind of proximity to the real thing. The trainers don't deliver polished Hollywood monologues. The fighters don't perform generic cinematic toughness. Eastwood preserved this texture carefully, resisting every temptation to sand down rough edges or make the world of film more conventionally appealing. The result is a cast that feels inhabited rather than performed. Audiences may never consciously identify what creates that feeling, but they feel it in every scene because it's rooted in something that existed before the screenplay ever did. The film's journey through award season was itself a near miss that almost became a complete miss. Its limited December release gave it almost no runway to build a kind of sustained critical momentum that typically drives serious awards consideration. By the time wider audiences found it in early 2005, much of the conversation around that year's contenders had already begun forming around films that had enjoyed longer and more strategically planned rollouts. For a period that felt genuinely precarious to those involved, the film appeared at risk of being treated as a later rival that critics admired but voters overlooked. The marketing campaign's commitment to protecting the viewing experience by revealing nothing about the story's true direction, while absolutely the right creative decision, worked against building the kind of urgent cultural buzz that fuels early awards momentum. Then something shifted. Word of mouth, the most unpredictable and most powerful force in the film industry, turned the tide with a speed that surprised everyone watching. Audiences who had seen the film didn't just recommend it. They urged others toward it with a specific intensity of people who had been changed by something and needed others to understand why. The film swept the major Academy Award categories, a later rival that outran every competitor when it mattered most. Before this film, each of its principal performers occupied a clearly defined lane in how the industry perceived and used them. Eastwood was a legend whose best directorial work was increasingly discussed in the past tense. Freeman was universally admired, but often cast in roles that asked little of him beyond his natural authority and warmth. Swank had won an Oscar years earlier for Boys Don't Cry, but had struggled to maintain that level of critical momentum in the years since. The film changed all three trajectories in ways that extended far beyond a single award cycle or box office result. Eastwood's direction silenced every suggestion that his creative vitality had diminished with age. Freeman delivered a performance dense with regret, tenderness, and quiet devastation that reminded everyone watching what he could reach when given material genuinely worthy of his depth. For Swank, the transformation was the most complete and immediate. Her portrayal of Maggie Fitzgerald wasn't a comeback. It was a redefinition. She won her second Academy Award and demonstrated with absolute clarity that her earlier success had not been luck. All three emerged from the experience with careers that had been fundamentally and permanently reshaped by a story that asked more of them than almost anything they had done before. The backlash that followed the film's wider success complicated a legacy that had initially seemed headed toward uncomplicated celebration. The initial response from critics and audiences was almost entirely positive, a wave of admiration for the film's emotional precision and restraint. Awards followed. For a brief period, the conversation around the movie was defined almost entirely by appreciation. That consensus broke when the story's climax became more widely discussed in public discourse. Disability rights advocates raised concerns about what the film's resolution implied about the perceived worth of life lived with severe physical limitation. Religious commentators condemned the moral choice at the story's center without qualification. Political figures arrived to use the film as a launching point for arguments that stretched far beyond anything connected to cinema or storytelling. None of this diminished the film's artistic standing, but it permanently altered how the movie exists in cultural conversation. What had been universally praised became something people argued about rather than simply admired. In retrospect, that controversy may have done something important for its longevity. Films that provoke genuine moral debate tend to endure considerably longer than films that only collect praise. More than 2 decades after release, the film's final act continues to generate the same passionate disagreement it produced when audiences first encountered it. The choice Frankie makes in those closing scenes isn't something viewers process and file away as a completed experience. It circulates. It comes back during quiet moments. People who saw the film years ago still carry strong and often opposing convictions about whether what Frankie did was an act of the deepest possible love or crossing a line that should never be approached regardless of the circumstances. What sustains this division is the film's absolute refusal to guide anyone toward a conclusion. There is no reassuring epilogue, no character whose final speech explains what all meant. No narrative signal that tells viewers how to interpret what they just watched. The story presents a choice in its full agonizing complexity and then simply ends. Every new viewer who encounters that ending for the first time reignites the debate. Every conversation it prompts is a debate the filmmakers always intended to start and never intended to finish. What gives Million Dollar Baby its enduring power isn't the awards it collected or the controversy it survived, or even the performances that remain among the finest committed to film in that entire decade. It's the fact that the questions it raises haven't been answered by anything that's happened in the years since. Questions about dignity and personal choice and the weight of irreversible decisions made out of love aren't confined to dramatic fiction anymore. They live in hospitals and courtrooms and family conversations and legislative chambers around the world with the same urgency they carried when the film was made. Eastwood's refusal to anchor the story to any specific cultural moment, his deliberate avoidance of heavy messaging, contemporary references, or trendy filmmaking techniques, means the film exists almost outside of time. There's nothing in it that dates it to a particular decade or ties its meaning to a particular political climate. It simply tells a deeply human story with precision, honesty, and a moral courage that most of Hollywood was too afraid to consider. That combination doesn't expire. It doesn't age. And it ensures that anyone willing to sit with the questions this film asks will find them just as uncomfortable and just as alive as they were the first time anyone heard them.